Hello, and welcome back for our new lecture. Today I want to talk about the term Reformed Theravada. Theravada has been a fluid term for centuries, in that many descriptions can be found in the histories and scholarly literature. For this class, we're exploring the ways in which it appeared in the maritime sphere and also seeking to understand it within the context of a wider view of history and interactions within the great circle of Buddhism. Our model has been to see the spread of Buddhism over time and space in four formulations: early Buddhism, Mahayana, Tantra, and Reformed Theravada. The two suggested divisions of maritime Buddhism and practice into early Buddhism and Reformed Theravada raise many questions, and these lectures can only address a few of them. One of these inquiries is, how can one distinguish between early Buddhism and Theravada in a time earlier than the Reformed Theravada of 12th and 15th centuries? One of the answers, often given in our literature, is that there is no difference between the two. Early Buddhism and Theravada are identical. In other words, for some, early Buddhism is Theravada. However, to say that Theravada of today is identical to the range of thoughts and practices found in early Buddhism seems counterproductive to an accurate historical description of Buddhism. As I said, we have many examples of attempts to construct a clear definition of Theravada. For example, the French scholar Barrault based his descriptions on doctrine. For Theravada, he used the more than 200 doctrinal positions found in the Kathavatu as the basis by which this school could be identified. In more current scholarship, such as the work of Prabodh Assavarulhakarn, we find the focus on determining when Theravada became ascendant, a clearly recognized dominant school. He's made an important contribution to our understanding of the dynamics of Theravada. First, by dividing the tradition into two zones: Western, made up of Pyu, Mon, and Deva Ravati, modern-day Myanmar, Thailand, and the northern Malay Peninsula; and the Eastern, comprising Khmer, Cham, Javanese, that is Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia. In the Western zone, he outlines three configurations in terms of temporal developments: Hinayana, followed by Mahayana, and then the ascendancy of Theravada. The date for the presence of Theravada in the Western zone has been established as the 4th century. and a century later for the Eastern Zone. Written historical documents began to appear in Sri Lanka by this date. While early Buddhism was present in Sri Lanka, so too was Mahayana and Tantra. It was not until the developments in the 11th and 12th centuries in Sri Lanka that we can with assurance speak of a dominating role of Theravada. In one sense, we should consider the difference between the presence of Theravada and its ascendancy. When we outline the whole of the maritime world, that is the coast and the hinterland river cultures, we note there is no attempt to show ascendancy of Theravada in India or Sri Lanka in those early centuries. For the maritime Buddhist history, the use of the term early Buddhism, with its multiple schools, monastic life and practices, and remembered words, is one way of creating an umbrella category for the presence of the tradition. Early Buddhism, as found in South Asia, was not the exact equivalent of the Theravada that became ascendant. This raises the issue of whether there is any way to differentiate ascendant Theravada from all of the other schools of early Buddhism. One aspect of differences can be seen in how the person of the Buddha was conceived by the various traditions. Was the Buddha, described as an arhat, uniquely different from other arhats? This question was addressed in the interpretation of the story of the twin miracle. The Buddha was able to create his twin and even to interact with that persona as a miracle done to convince the audience of his power. The image that appeared had fire and water streaming from it. There is no other event in the life of the Buddha that has appeared more often in narrative art. For Theravada, such a miracle can only be performed by the Buddha, not by any other arhats. So the focus on the historical Buddha sets this tradition apart from those who conceived of multiple Buddhas appearing in the 10 directions, while a number of groups saw the Buddha teaching through a spiritual manifested body that was transcendent in terms of birth and death. The Theravada tradition rejects such claims. Thus, we understand the importance of celebrating the birth of the Buddha, who is held to be fully human, subject to karmic conditions and death. In one sense, Theravada can be described as a movement based on the life story and the remembered words of the Buddha 2,600 years ago. He is seen as the Buddha of our epoch. Other Buddhas have existed in the distant past, but the importance of Gautama Buddha cannot be ignored. It is through his birth and the efforts that the teaching has been given for our time and place. Therefore, Ascendant Theravada kept the focus on the Buddha, who was born in the Ganges Basin. From this, we can understand that when many speak of the identity of Theravada to early Buddhism, it is based on the idea that preserving the words and thought of the founder is the way to identify with the oldest layer of Buddhism. Whatever occurred during early Buddhism has to be judged against the constructed history of what Gautama Buddha taught and practiced. Over the centuries, Theravada has returned again and again to this theme of purifying the tradition, removing the introductions that reflect a later stage of Buddhism, correcting the additions of the canonic text to make sure no changes have been inserted, and recalling the life of the Buddha in ritual, art, and stories. In the 5th century, the imposing figure of Buddhaghosa came into Buddhist history. He belongs in the list of those who made their way by sea to study and spread Buddhism. Born a Brahmin, he converted to Buddhism and set sail with a group of merchants going to Sri Lanka. There he planned to study the commentaries, and especially the Abhidhamma text, at the famous Mahavihara monastery. When seeking to be instructed in that advanced text, he had to first undergo a formidable test of his knowledge. Given 2 stanzas from the Pali Samyutta Nikaya, he was asked to write a commentary explaining the content. In essence, the verses taught that the one who sought to master Shila, the precepts, should give thought to samadhi, meditation, and panna, wisdom. The 3 are said to be antidotes for greed, hate, and delusion. For these 2 stanzas, Buddhaghosa wrote over 750 pages of commentary in what is now known as the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification. The senior monks at Mahavihara recognized his promise, and they assisted him in his task of recording and shaping the interpretation of the words of the Buddha, kept alive by memory and recitation. He did not just study and make comments on words and meaning. He gave the words of the Buddha a whole new dimension. They were seen by him as limitless in meaning and timeless, in that each word had an effect immediately. In other words, he gave the words of the Pali text an importance and a function that elevated them to a sphere of never-ending expansion and impact. In the view of Buddhaghosa, the meaning of the words in the Pali Canon were never separated from the phrasing or the sounds that the Buddha used when teaching. while early Buddhism had attempted to retain the words of the Buddha, under the approach of this pilgrim to Sri Lanka, the words came to have a special place for practice, faith, and insight. This view of the importance of the words can be seen in all of the efforts that the tradition put forward to preserve them precisely. A major part of the reformed Theravada down to our present time has been to make sure of the completeness and the accuracy of the editions of the Pali text. Whether it was in Myanmar, when the revisions were carved in stone, or the fact that the first digital canonic database was the Siam edition, the Pali Canon remains crucial to Theravada. The term sasana is an inclusive term that is probably the closest equivalent to our English Buddhism. And it would work for any of these types. The present discussion is about sasana. That is, Buddhism in all its cultural, social, historical, and public practices. Buddhism, sasana, has been in constant change from the first systematic organization until the present. Now, the Atlas of Maritime Buddhism has used the expression reformed Theravada to distinguish a particular time and place occurrence within Buddhist history. It is used to refer to the form of the tradition as it existed after a series of councils and reforms that helped to structure the canonic text and the teachings, practices, and the doctrines which are part of the tradition today. The historical accounts of how Theravada has preserved the ancient form of Buddhism has been punctuated with descriptions of councils or gatherings of monks. Over the centuries, we hear of these councils, giving consideration to the remembered words of the Buddha, as well as the maintenance of the monastic order and the preservation of doctrinal interpretations. The first 4 councils have been the focus of much scholarship, and they are descriptions of how the sasana was developed from the death of Shakyamuni up to the Common Era. Now, the subsequent councils that have been specific to Theravada have been much less studied. From the 11th century, we have accounts of monks gathering to reform the monastic Sangha. In 1078, monks from Bagan in Myanmar arrived at Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka to reestablish proper ordination in the sasana. A series of councils began in the 13th century in Sri Lanka in 1222 and 1266 to reform and bring unity to the Buddhist monastic community. 14th century councils were held in Kot in Sri Lanka, 1362 and 1369, which attempted to bridge the differences within the Sangha. The rulers of Kot, which can be seen as a political mandala rather than an empire, were at the center of a prosperous maritime trading network that included direct ties with China. The councils attracted monks from mainland Southeast Asia and were crucial events in the structuring of the monastic and practicing communities of the ascending, reformed Theravada. The councils, held in Kot, were praised for bringing about decades of unity between the monasteries and their occupants. A series of such councils continued into the 15th century, seeking to standardize the canonic text, the monastic ordinations, and the structure of governance. The meetings were not limited to Sri Lanka. They were taking place over a period of several centuries. 1424 in Sri Lanka, 1577 in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and 1788 in Bangkok. A 19th century council, 1877, in Mandalay, Myanmar, reviewed the canonical readings and inscribed their conclusions of the acceptable wording on nearly 800 marble stone tablets. It has been called the world's largest book. In terms of the maritime world, these councils have involved the travel of delegates and representatives back and forth by sea between Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. Ordination was a major issue, and monks traveled back and forth between Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia, trying to remove differences in practice and lineage. If you explore the literature on Buddhist councils, you will get the well-established list of the 4 councils in India up to the time of Ashoka. The 5th, held at the turn of the Common Era in Sri Lanka. A 6th one in Mandalay in the 19th century, and the so-called 6th Council held in 1950s in Myanmar, when once again the canonic texts were recited to the attendees as a new edition which removed former misreadings. The Atlas of Maritime Buddhism is giving recognition to the less well-known meetings held in the 12th to 15th centuries that included monks moving along the established trade routes from distant ports. It was a crucial time for Theravada Buddhist history, and we need to understand the role that such gatherings have played for the efforts and the results of those who organize these councils. It is appropriate to say what we have today is a reformed Theravada. It is the dominant and the surviving form of Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia along the rim of the Great Circle. The situation in China from the 13th to the 17th centuries, when the Mongols and the Ming dynasties ruled, was not conducive to the spread of Buddhism that was developed along the maritime routes of Southeast Asia. Sea trade was becoming dominated by Islamic merchants, and they helped to displace Buddhism of the past centuries. As a result, Mahayana and Tantra faded in importance in the islands of the South Seas, and there was no base of population left to give support to reformed Theravada. In this way, the religious map of our present time came into existence. Islam finding a new major home in Indonesia and Malaysia. Theravada coming to dominate mainland Southeast Asia and India, adapting to the Vedic and Hindu practices. In the 20th century, we had the beginning of a new expansion of Theravada into parts of Vietnam, Singapore, Nepal, India, and through immigrants, North America, and Europe. Our course is providing snapshots of religious activity over a vast territory. It is the accumulation of a big data set of information, and of necessity involves complex descriptions and the need for analysis that can explain or interpret such massive histories. So I hope the lectures help you to summarize in ways that are meaningful. Your patience and focused studies of the issues are much appreciated. Thank you very much.